Hey, hello everyone, both in the room and online. It is lovely to have you here. My name is Dr. Joanna Wagniewska. I'm a departmental lecturer in environmental science, and I co-run the PG Cert in ecological survey techniques. And I would love to welcome you to this event, which is co-run by the Ecological Survey Techniques and the Sustainable Urban Development Programme. So just as a shout out, we have quite a number of environmentally themed courses here at Oxford Lifelong Learning. So if this is something you're interested in, you're more than welcome to check it out, have a look, see what it is that you're doing, that we're doing, and then of course sign up for all of it. But it is my great pleasure to host this event. The way that we will run it is first we will hear from our keynote speaker, who's Oscar Kimball, and then we will have a panel discussion with two more speakers who I will introduce in a second. And then we will open the floor to questions, and we'll take questions from both the room and online. So if you are online, please do ask questions. The chat is going to be probably the best option because there's quite a lot of you. So we have someone monitoring the chat and I will pick up on the questions as well. Okay, so without further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. Oscar Kimball, who's an associate professor in ecology. He is working as a senior environmental consultant at Kelowna IB, and he specializes in ecology, species conservation, risk assessment, sustainable urban development, and planning of new transport infrastructure. And he's also a guest researcher at Chalmers University of Technology in Gothenburg. And apart from doing the more theoretical modeling aspect of his job, Oscar also has a lot of field experience with a range of species, so from insects such as butterflies or dragonflies or grasshoppers to also amphibians and reptiles and mammals such as bats or hazel dormice. So we're very privileged to have him here. And I think, Oscar, the floor is now yours.
Oh, thank you very much. Yeah, hi everybody. I'm very pleased to be here. I will talk about urban planning and how we can promote biodiversity. And I think one of the concepts that are really valuable in this theme is functionality, habitat functionality. Yeah. So let's see if it can. Habitat functionality is quite a new concept, not in an ecological point of view, basically, because it has been addressed many times in ecology, but the way it's analyzed, it's quite strange that it hasn't been made in this way for a long time, but it's quite recent, only during the last decade or so, where they have started to really calculate a value, calculating this measure. And it's a concept that is based on both habitat quality variation in the landscape and the connectivity variation in the landscape. Putting these two concepts together, then we get the functionality. So it doesn't really pay off to be very good quality habitat for a species. It has also have to be connected. And so it's highlights this importance of both connectivity and the quality and the landscape. Another good thing when modeling this, that you don't have a priori have to define the habitat, not as a patches. In many of the work that I've been involved in before, like metapopulation dynamics and so on, you have to be able to delimit the patches as something that take all the resources that the species need for the whole life. And that is tricky on the scale of urban planning, because usually we work on much smaller scale than many of the population works. And with this concept, with the functionality, you can actually, apply it on almost every scale. And also, it's very useful for the impact assessment. If you want to calculate what will be the impact of this development that we are planning, and you can calculate as the sum of functionality, and then you can also work with restorations and identify how much you have to do to mitigate the functionality losses that you have in your plans. So I think that is the main benefits of this habitat functionality concept. But as I said, it's a quite new concept. I wrote a paper or I made a model already in 2017, and we published the paper in 2023. And that paper, what I believe is one of the first in this context.
Can you go back to the previous slide?
Yeah.
Just a simple question. The urban habitat quality functionality map of Gothenburg. It looks like both sides of the river are zero functionality. Why is that?
Here is very much urban structures with hard sealed land and so on. So it's very low functionality.
And functionality defined.
I will come to that. But it's new. But there are several papers, and I want to pinpoint one of them, and that is on mortar. With and a group from Norway that have made this ecology paper just a couple of years ago, which really introduced you into the concept of ecology. And I made a paper that was published last Christmas, almost, together with people from Chalmers that work with urban modeling, the place syntax models, and we integrated these kind of models into each other. And in a project together with Chalmers, I also developed a tool where this functionality can be calculated based on input maps and parameter settings for a couple of species. And this tool, which is a plugin to QGIS, is something that creates all these maps automatically, so you don't have to do so much work actually. And the important maps regarding habitat functionality and what I'm going to talk about today is the quality map and the dispersal probability map and the functionality. And the habitat functionality is something that is calculated based on the habitat quality and the dispersal map. And it's just a matter of multiplying the pixel values from the two maps, and you get the functionality. With this tool, the parameters for the different species that you want to model can be put together in a single Excel file. And then in this case, there is a lot of species in the same file, and they have different parameter settings related to the different biotopes in the map that you use as input. And it looks like that. This is an example, very recent example from functionality modeling in Uppsala in eastern Sweden, where we focus just on the bat species occurring in that area. And this is a prediction of the functionality in that area. And here you can compare the prediction of functionality with observations within the area that was surveyed. So you can't really say that here is no observations, but because it was on the sample there. But you can also see that they are really aggregating at places where there are some functionality and avoiding these non-functional areas, which are expected and often found when you apply this. There might be some errors in such maps, like if you have made a biotope map based on data that are not really representative for the landscape, then it might be very odd patterns, of course, and that is important to identify. So it's the modeling approach is very important. You do validations where you compare it with data in different ways, and then also calibrate the models becomes better over time. In this place in Uppsala, they are planning now to densify the amount of buildings will be more, and they have some different developed steps. 1, 2, 3, and 4, and we have then made a scenario analysis doing that with this model to compare what will happen if you increase the amount of buildings in that area. And there is a lot of forest and very old trees in the area, so you would expect to have effects on the bats. And what you can see is that already in this first step, which almost take no new land into account, just densify areas that are already built, there is a decrease in functionality among the investigated species between up to 5% decrease. But in the other steps, it will be even more, up to 12% decrease in functionality.
Oscar, just a second. For the people online, we will take questions a little bit later. So after the talk from Oscar and after the panel. So I'm just gonna remove your hands up. If you could hold off for half an hour or so, that would be brilliant. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry for that. It's not that I'm ignorant about that.
Someone's back. Thank you.
Because now we come into the kind of maps that are based on the functionality maps and the disposal map and the quality map. You can produce maps like this that show you the potential of increasing the functionality in an area at every point in the landscape by doing either increasing the connectivity, as in the left map here, or by increasing just the quality, as in the right map here. So it's the same area, but different potentials. And for the bats, you see there is a lot of points or dots along what you would expect to be the roads, and that is lights. So the potential to increase connectivity or the possibilities to reach the food by the bats is to just lock them down or adjust them in some way. Maybe not having them having the light there all the night through or something, or change the spectrum of the light. So you can see each of those dots is something that you might do something to improve the reachability to food items for the bats. And in the other map, you can see the light areas are such places where you can do very much by increasing the amount of food. And one way of doing that for bats is to add, for example, new ponds in the area, which produce those insects that they mainly feed upon. But it could also be that you add some grazed area where there is cattle that produce then dung beetles, which are also very much consumed by the bats. And those things can, of course, be something to do. And the municipality want really to do this new buildings and densification of the area, so they have also to do mitigations, and they have selected to do that based on these maps and that information. And then we can do new scenarios with mitigations together with the exploitations. And we found actually that there will be, instead of this decrease in the first step between -2 to -5%, it will be either a stage quo situation for some of the species or one of the species. And for the one that was one of those that were affected most, it was actually a 9% better situation in terms of functionality after the construction with mitigations than the current situation. And that's quite interesting to have this net gain situation. And the functionality is very good and robust measure of this, I think, especially when you can show that the species that you're modeling also fit quite well to the predictions. So the benefits of these restoration potential maps is that they really are quite easy to produce, especially if you have developed the models, then they are really rapid to produce for big landscapes, and you can have this information then on every pixel in the landscape, and you can combine them with information on feasibility, because it might not be possible to do these things everywhere. You have to own the land maybe to be able to do these things, or these measures that are needed and so on. But one thing is also that the habitat functionality is a better measurement when you have very limited amount of space to work upon. Think of this example, for example. Functionality increase with both connectivity and habitat quality. So you have in the upper right, you have the highest functionality with the same area of space. But you can also think of it, if you have very limited space as the circle in the upper right, let's think that is a hectare of green area, then the functionality is the same there as this big area in the bottom left corner of the right diagram. So that is very much a good way of working with limited space to try to increase both the connectivity and the quality. That's something to work upon, which is very good for urban planning. And I think maybe we should, I can take another example, but what do you think?
Let's do it.
Yeah, just to show you another example, I applied this for almost all species of bats in Sweden, but also amphibians and in this case the smooth snake. And this is the functionality map for quite large area, and here is a developed plan that they want to almost destroy completely and replace it with an industry area. And then I applied these restoration maps there, and what was interesting was that when I applied the connectivity map there was within the area where they can do these mitigations, there was almost no potential at all, because it was already well connected. But on the other hand, the potential map of the type that shows the potential when increased in quality, on the other hand, was really promising. And when summing up all this potential, it was shown that it was enough to cover for the losses within the exploitation area, which is the blue area there. And if you delimit all these high potential areas, I was in this case able to also investigate those in field just to see whether it was feasible to do the restoration measures. And actually it was, but not in all of them actually. And that is interesting and very informative. And in the yellow ones here, there was problems because there was the trees that have to be taken away to get a better local climate, which would increase the quality for the snake at the spot, was deciduous trees. And if you do that, it might be worse habitat because of so many of shoots that will grow quite rapidly after a clear cut or something. And that I didn't realize from the beginning, but it could have been controlled for by just viewing the map to see that, okay, it's too much deciduous forest in those spots. And also were very high quality on some of the deciduous forest there. So it would not have been a good site anyway, but this kind of information is also there. So I think using the potential maps, combining it with some kind of mapping of the feasibility of doing the measures is the solution for many of these problems. And by that, I think I end up. So thank you.
Very much, Oscar. I'll have you sit down over here, and I am now going to invite two of my colleagues to sit right next to you. We'll have a little panel discussion, and we'll all be very cozy here because of how the camera is set up. But just to introduce you to who is sitting and will be sitting next to me. So we've got Dr. Francesca Freud, who is a departmental lecturer here at Oxford Lifelong Learning on the MSc in Sustainable Urban Development program. And she focuses on three aspects of sustainable urban development. So one is urban morphology and spatial organization of cities. She's also interested in evolutionary economic geography and the factors that influence economic diversification and economic complexity in cities. And thirdly, she also looks at local governance and the ways in which local policy makers will work together and govern economic and spatial complexity in cities. So we've got our urban person here, but next to her is Thomas Hesselberg, who is my co-director on the Ecological Survey Techniques program. So Thomas specializes in spiders, and particularly in cave spiders and orb spiders and their behavior, but also looking at how they adapt to different environmental changes around them. I think we'll start off. I'm going to sit down next to you, and I'm going to ask.
I have one clarification.
Yes.
From Oscar. The urban functionality equals the sum of quality and dispersal potential. Could you tell us
or the product of it, and multiplying them.
what's the quality, what's dispersal potential? How do you define those two?
But
What is the quality and how do you define quality?
Okay.
And what is dispersal
Yeah.
potential?
the quality is in many cases the expected amount of food at the place.
Mhm.
So the more food or other resources there is for the species, the better.
Mhm.
And then all these resources might not be reachable by the species from the point where they are born or where they are nest.
Mhm.
And if so, then the connectivity and barriers and such things might reduce the functionality of all the resources.
And I'm going to take more questions in a second, but I think this brings us really nicely to my first question. I'm only going to ask two questions because I know that people do want to ask theirs. But my first question to all of you is, what does connectivity mean for you? Because we come from slightly different fields. And I'm going to bring up the fact that when I think Francesca and I had our first meeting, and she said, "Oh, we're off to a conference on active transport." And as a biologist who trained in general biology, I assumed she means how substances move from one side of a cell membrane to another. That was not the case. She meant cycling. So we all come from different backgrounds and we have slightly different notions. So what does connectivity mean to you? And I'm going to actually, I'll start with Francesca.
Okay. Yeah, well, thank you. It's very nice to be on this panel. So in fact, I've been following Oscar's work for a while because I find it really interesting because it fits with my understanding of cities as very connected, interconnected places. So we have a teaching week this week for our master's students on governance and leadership and future cities. And one of the things we're talking about is that cities are complex. They have lots of overlapping networks in them. And one of the networks is biodiversity. And I think often in planning, we don't really understand that. We don't think about cities as being sort of parts and wholes. We don't think, okay, there are lots of little ecological niches, but actually biology means that the animals or the insects or the frogs spread. So they don't treat the city as just a set of niches. They kind of move and disperse across cities. So I think it's really interesting, the work that Oscar's doing to actually start making us think at urban scale. So going beyond individual plots to the urban and thinking how buildings and streets and walls can be barriers or they can be enabling factors. So we have to, as planners, we have to be really aware that we have a role in ecology and it's beyond the individual plot. So I hope that.
Thank you. Thomas, you'll be up next.
Yes, so just sort of following on from that kind of discussion. So I come from sort of one of the teachings I do is in sort of island ecology. And one of the concepts of island ecology is the idea, obviously, that if you imagine an island, you have a quite remote area where the number of species and the animals that can reach those kind of things is dependent on how far away it is from the mainland, but also the number of species that can be supported in that particular area depends on the size of the island. But if you think about urban environments as well, we do actually get quite a lot of similarities. So if you imagine the kind of green spaces we have in urban environments, it's basically we have sort of perhaps a small park here, another small park here, and some of those will be managed better for biodiversity than others. But the problem is if we just have those isolated patches, unlike islands, urban environments are actually quite small, right? We don't actually, in many cases, have enough space to sustain populations. So what we need to think about is how do species and individuals reach those different areas, right? So there's two different ways we can do it in cities. One of them is sort of the stepping stone model. That's a bit similar to what we have in islands, right? If you want to reach a far island as a species, you might sort of step on different islands to get to that island quite far from the mainland. Right? So you establish some populations and stuff like that. So that's potentially one model, right? You can have more different areas and you can have, so you're connecting them via stepping stones. But unlike the island analogy, what we can also have in cities is greenways, basically, right? So we can have these kind of linear features that actually connects the different. And there's of course pros and cons of each of those. So establishing greenways in cities is, if they're not already there, quite tricky actually, because that will typically actually involve getting rid of buildings or roads or things like that. So that's often not feasible. So actually, in many cases, we do have to use the similar models as when we do sort of islands with sort of stepping stones. So we create some small patches here and some small patches there. And the size that we need actually depends on what kind of species we're talking about, right? So if we're talking about something like a fox, we're talking about a different area potentially than if we're talking about something like a bee or something like that. So even in many urban biodiversity cases, even something as small as gardens can potentially work as stepping stone as long as they're managed in a proper way. So I guess that's what I think about connectivity.
Thank you. And Oscar, over to you.
Yeah, okay. I of course agree with you both in the way one can view this, but I want to emphasize another thing which I think is really important, and that is it's not always so that a specific structure like a corridor, like morphological thing like a hedgerow or something is the important thing here. It might be that the most important factor in terms of connectivity is the production of the individuals. You can have whatever structure you want. If you don't have a production of new individuals, a good reproduction rate, you will not have the usage of these corridors. So, and actually, if you really increase the quality and the production, the sources of migrants, it might not even be needed because they will fly over this trafficated road anyway. But on the other, it's very few individuals, then it doesn't work anyway because there's so few individuals that will come to the other place, or it will almost be a zero probability of movement. So the demographic traits or rates are very important, I think, to take into consideration. So you need both. You need good quality sources where the species can reproduce and a lot of food and so on. So the resources has to be there. And then we can think of cities as having all these things for some of the species that we want, and we can help them by increasing some of these elements.
Great, thank you very much, Oscar. This brings me to my second question, second and final from me, and then it's going to be all up to you. So if we think about cities and urban spaces, all of them are slightly different. They're individual because of where they're located, how they have been built, the historical aspect, social aspect, everything. And restoration efforts have to acknowledge that there isn't a one-size-fits-all scenario. But still, are there some underlying basic principles that could be applicable across the board that people could use as a starting point for any sort of guidance? And we'll start with Thomas and then move on to Francesca and then finish with Oscar, if that's okay.
Yeah, so basically, I think one first thing to sort of realize is that cities can actually be quite good for the environment, right? They can be quite good for biodiversity, even in situations perhaps where you wouldn't expect it. So I was involved in a study in Dhaka in Bangladesh on butterfly diversity. I don't know how well you know Dhaka, but it's a very urbanized area, right? There's very little green space actually. But what that study found was even in situations like this, actually 50%, almost 50% of the whole population or whole number of species of butterflies in Bangladesh could actually be found within the city. So they have some botanical garden, there was a university campus and some parkland. So even in a quite polluted and really urbanized city like that, we do actually can get quite utilized or very good biodiversity. So I think that's the sort of first step. We can do quite good things. And now I kind of forgot the name.
That might be different cities.
So the underlying principle, I guess, is actually, as we talked about before, it's actually the size of the green space as well to some extent. So even when we have quite poor connectivity, as we do have in cities like this, because you have quite large green spaces, and obviously butterflies, obviously, as we talked about before, connectivity depends on the species we're looking at. Butterflies are quite good at flying long distances and potentially cross something like a very trafficable road, whereas something like a frog would not be able to do that, right? So we have to think these kinds of things into consideration. But even in situations like that, it depends, as long as there is some suitable habitat, and as Oscar said as well, suitable habitat that actually allow individuals to reproduce and grow the population, you can actually get quite good things. So I think space, and habitat size and habitat quality, as we talked about before, is as important as the connectivity, but it depends on the species that we are looking at.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, so this is an interesting question. I mean, I think there are commonalities across cities, and that cities generally have interconnected street networks and buildings and walls. And so we're always thinking a bit about these connectivity and barrier aspects. But I think every city is unique. I was reading about policies in Amsterdam actually to identify ecological bottlenecks. So where are the kind of points within the system, the urban system, where actually there's a kind of block, there's a barrier effect. They were talking about the sides of a canal. So you'd have thought canals were good places for biodiversity, but actually the sides of the canal were so steep that the wildlife couldn't get in and out. So they'd actually identified and mapped their own particular bottlenecks and then thought about their own particular solutions, which in this case were little stairways going up the canal side. So that's one thing we can all do differently in each city. The other option is to think about the potentials for good things to happen. So it's interesting in Oscar's work, you can actually identify parts of the city that are already really well connected in terms of species dispersal, but actually the habitat quality is poor. So if you go in and do some remediation work in that particular space, you'll have an exponential effect compared to other parts of the city. So these kind of areas of latent potential where we could actually do a lot quickly are really, I think every city can probably identify those. And also just to say, so we're actually all four of us, and also Oliver in the audience, we're doing a project together on trying to take the model that Oscar's been doing in Gothenburg and other places to Oxford. So we're at the moment looking at the university estates and the college estates and actually thinking about what's particular about Oxford really and what biodiversity kind of hotspots are there. And interestingly, one of the kind of bottlenecks we've identified is maybe the walls around the colleges, which I don't think you'd put in your model, because actually all of our colleges do quite often have quite, tall walls and they're a bit impenetrable. So maybe in Oxford, we have to think slightly differently about what these ecological bottlenecks might be.
Okay. I've been working with walls before, but mainly in the terms of these steep walls that can be along big infrastructure, transport infrastructure, which also even produce more barrier effects than the road itself sometimes. But what I think is general very good to do in cities is to promote trees, especially old trees, and be very careful about them, because they are often the parts that makes a city or urban environment better than many of the areas outside the city, where the forest management have been so long traditional, so there is no old trees anymore, just productive forest. And these are really important, I think, for the diversity in cities. And in many cities, there is a lot of the old trees. And I also think it's very important to think about the waters, to having water that have soft edges, not only these steep ones. I think that works well for biodiversity in so many cities to have that. And of course, there are some problems with that also, because not all people like too much mosquitoes or something. So we have to give place for nature to also have the predators like the bats that feed upon them, or the swallows, swifts that also eat a lot of those insects. But I think trees and water is very important. And the third thing, which I also think is very important, is to not have lights everywhere. To think about how to find other solutions for that. Maybe have the light just lit when you're moving there, parts of the night, or something like that. Or also put the light in other directions than right upon the walls on churches or church. I have so hard with that word.
Churches.
Yeah, and sorry, and trees. And so don't have too much light on those, down to the ground instead.
Great, thank you. And now it's your turn. So we have one person already eager in the audience, but Sarah at the back has her eye on the chat. So if you're joining us online, if you could drop a question in the chat, that would be fantastic. I'll try to go one question in the room, one question online, unless there's a bottleneck somewhere on one side or the other. Okay, first question.
Thank you. So I'm an architect, work practice in London. My experience of the Greater London Authority brought in biodiversity net gain criteria quite recently, and I had experience of working with that on several projects, but one of them was effectively a suburban scale piece of land that transformed into quite a dense piece of new town. But that by the sort of technical criteria of the calculation, it required this quite absurd level of greenery that was required on a very compact site. The second part of that was right next door was a railway, the new Elizabeth line. And in this country, the railways have gone around, or Network Rail have cut down all the trees within 20 metres of train lines and whatnot. So the problem to me seems that it's this kind of issue of land ownership, or so nature doesn't respect the red lines of land ownership. Then there are very simple ways maybe of offsetting the quality of the landscape just on a neighbouring site, but because it's different ownerships of land, different management regimes, it doesn't happen. So I wonder from Sweden or from other places whether there's examples of landowners or developers working together to kind of overcome quite a bureaucratic approach to biodiversity.
Yeah, I don't know if the question is to me.
Go for it, Oscar.
Yeah, I think it's a problem everywhere that you have this big infrastructure will change cause barriers both for people and for animals, plants in many areas, especially when it becomes a big infrastructure. And it's all hard to overcome it without mitigations like overpasses or underpasses. For many of the bat species that are very much into forest, it could be that underpasses is very good and works quite well, even with broader infrastructure like that.
I think also one general problem with the whole biodiversity net gain concept in urban environments is that you're actually, so you can develop one piece of land and then you say, okay, I'm going to build, I'm going to create a larger nature reserves on this other area of the city. But the problem is if you're taking out an area, as we talked about, that is very well connected to other sources, and then you're now putting in a bigger area, but it's not well connected, you're actually going to lose species, right? You're not actually going to be able to regenerate that particular spot. And I think one of the problems with the net gain concept is that they don't always think of it in terms of the whole landscape or the whole cityscape in this case.
Yeah, I mean, it's a classic example in a way of the parts not being thought of as a whole. And I think it will be very interesting that the local nature recovery strategies in the UK are really just coming online now. So I know in Oxford that the county council developed that in November last year, and it'd be what I hope is that then there'll be people who try and bring together what's happening on these individual development plots and think about them in the round. But the problem is, are they linked enough into planning? I mean, or are they kind of wish lists? So I think it's this thing of trying to, I mean, again, it comes back to governance, how all of these different people with different interests talk to each other. And as you say, landowner collaboration would be a very interesting outcome of those strategies, maybe.
And then quality, I think your diagram with the quality, the impact of quality over, can compensate for it.
But this is something that we see on all scales. So this morning we went to show Oscar Park Farm, and part of it belongs to university, part of it belongs to Exeter College, then Magdalen College, then Hertford College, and the estates people are trying to get all the owners to talk to each other, and it's not possible so far. Hopefully it will change. And that's such a micro scale management, and each plot of land is managed slightly differently with different priorities. And then on the other hand, in Europe, you've got so many countries which have different policies, and at the same time, a species like large carnivores will roam across all of these countries, and in some places they're shot, and in some places they're not, and in some places there are roads, and in some places there are overpasses. So it's not a problem that's unique to the Elizabeth line, unfortunately. But yeah. We'll take one question from online now, Sarah. Pick your favorite.
I'll go from top to bottom. So one of the attendees is interested in the case study about modelling the effect of densification. Could you comment on whether this is broadly generalisable, densification equals reduced biodiversity functionality, or only for this specific case? There is a lot of calls for densification from an efficiency and carbon perspective, but it is interesting to think about its other potential side effects.
Maybe I should take
Yeah,
that one. Okay. Yeah, I think that it's very general. It's not general in the sense that it's always bats that are interested. It could be different species that are affected in different areas. But once picking the species that are expected to be affected in that area, then it's possible to do it in the same way. And it also goes for infrastructure, where you can find solutions for that is even better than putting new connections and so on. So yes.
Okay, brilliant. Now we've got yes.
Yeah, thank you guys. This has been wonderful. I'm actually looking into kind of predator populations in urban spaces as part of my dissertation, but I was curious, when you're comparing these models between, let's say, a butterfly or a snake or bats, how do you determine connectivity, and does it, I know we've been talking about it a lot, but does it really rely on ecological surveys in order to say, although technically this animal could get here, it's got a reasonable niche to occupy, but do you actually need to then confirm that it's truly an available niche based off of sightings, or how do you kind of confirm that data in your modeling?
I used the common knowledge about the data to create the models and set the parameter values and so on, and also to develop the biotope maps in a way that it really covers the things that are assumed to be important for target species. But then, having done that, the important thing is to actually make predictions and compare it with known observations or make observations in that area to validate the model, because that's the only way actually to do it, because the model is based on things that it's hard to measure it. You can measure quality in the way they're doing this niche modeling, where they use different kinds of regression analysis, but it might be very dependent on that size where you build the model. So sampling information from many species, and sometimes also think that, for example, disposal data is something that is very much landscape dependent. So it might be if they have another landscape with another structure, they will move more than in the landscape where they have studied. So the calibration of the model in relation to known observation is, I think, is the good approach. And you get better models over time by applying it on different landscapes. That is my experience.
Great, thank you so much.
Great. Sarah,
Yeah.
one from online.
So we have a question from somebody in Minnesota, USA. Their city is in the midst of creating their first climate action plan, and as part of that work, an urban forest and green infrastructure plan. The question is, what's a good first step for cities wanting to incorporate ecological connectivity into their plans and policies?
Hi, Oscar.
Okay.
We just
Thank you for that. I think this kind of modeling works on any scale. So you can do that for when you're doing the overall planning as well. And that is very good to do that for a couple of species. And you can select the species based on what kind of environment do you have in that area. I have done this kind of modeling for areas as big as several counties in Sweden at the same time, and that really gives you a picture where there is really good areas, big areas with much functionality, and areas that are less so, and that gives you information about the sensitivity in different areas of applying new infrastructure or densifications of different kind. So I think it's a good approach on those scales and those plans.
Just to say, I mean, as part of that exercise, though, it would be quite interesting to talk to people about their sightings and about valuable biodiversity spots in Minnesota, but also to try and do this process of identifying where the bottlenecks might be and where the areas of high potential might be, because that can be a collaborative exercise, and it's quite an interesting way of bringing people on board with your green infrastructure strategy, I imagine.
And also just linking to the previous question as well, actually. So we're quite lucky nowadays that there's quite a lot of sort of citizen science type data on observations of different species. Like we have iNaturalist, for example. You can go and look where have they actually been spotted within cities. And in the UK, we have a really good recording schemes for a number of different species, like I'm sure you know the garden bird Watson, the butterfly garden stuff. So we get really quite good data, observational data on where species are already found. And then we can sort of use the modeling to sort of see, well, here's the source stuff. Where can we potentially link or create other habitat that could spread these kind of observations to the rest of the city? So I think in general, that should work in different cities as well.
I'm going to amp it up a bit and take 2 questions from the audience and then take 2 questions from online. So I'm going to take your question and your question, and then we'll go back to online, and then we'll get some. Okay, off you go. Yes.
Thank you very much. Just a quick question. I think it follows the others that were asked. So as part of my work, I review environmental impact assessments, and a very important element of that is the mitigation. So for example, if there is a significant environmental impact, then you put forward relevant mitigation, and as part of that, usually monitoring is also important. So throughout the, for example, before construction or after construction, during operation, depends what the triggers are, but you would be carrying out this monitoring to see whether what you've put in place actually works or doesn't work. So as part of what Francesca's been saying with the nature local recovery schemes, a lot of the criticism is currently on, will the outcomes actually be the outcomes that we want them to be? Or how do we actually know that these corridors that you have mapped actually work? Because it will take, I assume, years to actually for the data to come in and prove or disprove kind of your predictions. But then the years have passed, developments have already made their profits. So I'm just thinking, where does the monitoring come in? And of course, anyone who is, whether this is promoted by local government or developers, will be conscious as to costs. So what is the minimum mitigation we can do in terms of these corridors, for example, or other elements that will deliver results? Because we don't want to spend too much, because that's always a concern that we, but then also we don't want to not do enough that it doesn't actually end up with the outcomes that we want.
Okay, wait, we're gonna take another one from.
At the same time.
Yes, at the same time, to make it more exciting. So remember a question about when the monitoring comes in? Okay.
Also extending from the questions that we had, especially on biodiversity net gain as well, when you show the comparison between before adding in the mitigation measure and after adding the mitigation measure, there's like a net gain in terms of the occurrences. I thought that would be such a better way of, I guess, measuring it, is like putting a comparison to biodiversity net gain, because it adds into that element of connectivity. So I think two questions embedded in this, sorry. One is, I think you sort of partially answered, but I wanted to confirm. Have you modeled kind of layers, because biodiversity net gain, the system in the UK, I think they specifically, they try to encourage all species, I guess. It's like all encompassing, but then that obviously comes with a lot of disadvantages and things that they overlooked. So I don't know whether you have modeled based on quite a, because I think the example you showed is one specific species. So I don't know if you have done that, sort of like more from terrestrial to pollinator, et cetera, and whether you have thought of, and second question is whether you have thought of, or have anyone from more municipal bodies have approached you on applying that to something similar to biodiversity net gain, for example, in the UK. Sorry, that's two questions.
Get 3 for.
Okay, I haven't worked with the British legislation in that way. I think one can use the modeling by applying it on several species. That this tool can handle many species. You can have a set of, maybe a generic set of species that you can apply, and then you can figure out all the effects on all these species and summarize it in some way.
That's in fact what we're trying to do with the project. So we have several species that we have chosen that we'll use.
Yes, it's quite a different range of species, basically from hedgehogs to snails to bats and dragonflies, to try and capture that kind of stuff. So what if we model really quite different species that have different requirements? Are the models, individual species model, actually going to agree, or are we going to end up with a lot of different,
big mess,
different mess? So we will kind of test that, and hopefully they will agree, at least to some extent.
And when it comes to the other question, I think that is really important to do this before after analysis to see whether mitigations are correct. And with this new type of restoration or mitigation potential maps, they have not been tested so far. The closer to that is that I have made evaluation of sites, whether they are manageable or not. But the mitigations that you suggest has to be, I think, well tested in different ways. And I used to not to suggest methods that we already know that they are not very practically working, or in other reasons. So it's more like that I suggest things that are doable and that we know have some effect, like turning down the lights, for example. We know that is effective for the bats.
Okay, Sarah, two questions from online, and then we'll do one last round, and then
Okay.
you'll be running out of time.
So one question is, how do you convince a society that maybe not as interested in ecology as the West is, to have more ecological spaces? And are there any economical benefits to it? And what are steps that are cost effective with the highest benefits that cities with constraints can employ? And the second question is, how can cities make decisions on which species they should promote? What happens for species often seen as nuisances or dangers, like raccoons and larger predators?
Are you going to take the first one?
Yeah, maybe I'll do the first one. Give you a bit of a break. Yeah, that's an interesting question about the kind of economic side of things. So in fact, the kind of specialist on our program who teaches all about ecosystem services and values and biodiversity is Desiree Daniel Altman, who's not here, but what she would say, I think, is that we can think of nature as intrinsically valuable, and a lot of us do. But there are also ways that nature and biodiversity actually provides all sorts of services to cities, some of which are easier to evaluate than others. So in a kind of ecosystem services model, you'd say that there were kind of provisioning services in terms of, I don't know, bees creating honey. But there are also these regulating services that I think we're realizing more and more are very important with climate change adaptation. So, you know, carbon sinks, toxic sinks, air pollution, shading in areas which have high urban heat island effects. And in a way, it might be more about cost savings than actually profits coming in. So, I mean, it's actually how you can build on the kind of nature-based systems that are there to kind of have things for free while also getting nature. And so reducing your costs as opposed to sort of seeing nature as somehow being a profitable venture, I would say.
But things like floodplains, for instance.
Well, exactly. I mean, yeah, and in a way, sometimes it pays to think not just about your city boundaries, your very urban boundaries, but to be thinking about cities in a more regional scale, because very often the kind of resources that cities can benefit from, like wetlands or mangroves, are actually on the periphery, but they still provide a really important green infrastructure to the city. And the problem is, because it's not necessarily economically valued, it's difficult for people to kind of understand how that contributes to the success of the city. So we need new ways of thinking about this, I think, within kind of urban accounting. And in terms of kind of the economic efficiency, I think this idea of focusing in on potential quality hotspots or potential bottlenecks, in a way, is quite a good way of saving a bit of money, because you're maximizing where you're investing. If you put it in an economic framework, you're not trying to increase biodiversity everywhere. You're actually understanding where it will have the most impact on the city as a whole. So in a way, it's a sort of efficient way of doing things.
Okay. And the other question, maybe I can say something about it. Actually, this functionality thing doesn't really help you in other way that you can model a lot of species and you can see those effects, but still we have to decide what we want to have in the city. So it's very much, I think there are several criteria that you have to take into account. And I think one of the important one is it's actually how feasible is it to manage the species, and how successful will different kind of mitigations or improvements of the green areas, how successful are they, and the knowledge about the mitigations effects and so on is really important there. And then I think that in many cases there's some species groups that are more easy to work with and more and another criteria that are important is what people think is something that we appreciate. So we can do very much what we want, I think.
Okay, last set of questions. We'll take these two, and that's going to be it, because we're already a few minutes over time. Okay, so two last questions from the room. Sorry, online people, write to us. Maybe we'll reply if there's not 200 of those questions. 1 and 2, okay?
Just going back to the point about the difficult to sort of outline the economic benefits, but one of the things that I thought would be a very interesting thing for you to map, because those very dense ecological areas are probably areas that people like to go to because they're pleasant and they're kind of where people go for strolls and walks, and whether you could potentially map those areas against places and go back to the people saying, oh, this is a lovely area that I go to for those reasons, because I think there's something quite powerful about us knowing instinctively that we go to areas and there's a whole huge amount of evidence around the benefits of blue and green in terms of people's well-being. And while you can't really articulate the economic benefit, I think you can from a well-being perspective, and you could potentially do some interesting mapping of those very rich areas, and they're the places people like.
That's very, and actually there's another whole layer to this, which is thinking about inequality in cities as well, and where the green areas are. I mean, that really has to be another layer of understanding, actually, because if everywhere that you're investing in is in the kind of wealthier part of the city, which has much less amenity value for the people living in the rest of the city, that's not a great urban strategy either. So it does get a bit more complex once you sort of layer in the people as usual. But I completely agree. I think that has to be built in somehow.
Yeah, actually, the reason why I am in the Swedish or the Chalmers University of Technology in Sweden now is because there are architects there who wants to bring these things together. So what we are doing now that we are modeling both the pedestrian movements and the reachability among people within the city and how reachable green areas are, and also quantifying the amount of species by modeling that and functionality of species, and also modeling those species that might be disturbed by people, and you have these things, and you by doing this integration of the modeling, we try to find solutions where we can optimize the both interests.
Just to point out, because you said that as well, I think there is actually also, we have to admit, a conflict between human usage of a site and biodiversity value, because those green areas that are particularly well visited, particularly people with dogs and everything else, are actually not that valuable from a biodiversity perspective anymore if, you know, the so disturbed species don't thrive. So it is complicated to sort of get these things.
Yeah, and mitigating, for example, functionality for bats could be to add ponds which produce midges, and maybe also mosquitoes that people don't like. So it's problematic and some conflicting, but it's worth studying it, and we hope to find better solutions.
Our final question.
My question was actually also about the conflict, because, well, we already touched upon the cost savings potentially if we take into account biodiversity, the benefits of it. We still, especially if we compare big projects in the West versus big projects in many other countries, there's massive discrepancies about how fast we can do something and how effective we can do something, and the cost savings are usually, let's say, not that I have any sympathy for the cost increases of the Tesla factory, but the Tesla factory that I had to be stopped several times to be built in, I think it was Brandenburg in Germany, because of the biodiversity. And for a lot of the population, there's actually a big question like, how is it possible that we keep stopping this and the benefit, and we are unable to build big projects anymore in especially European countries, because we take it into account. And I think still the big question for me is how can we bridge these demands? Because in other regions where it's very efficient, projects are built within weeks on time and everything, but as the previous question was also asking, not taking into account a lot of the biodiversity demands. And I was also wondering if a lot of the if there's potential for AI to actually speed up a lot of these modeling process to make sure that we can still build a factory and take this into account and have solutions that model this much faster than right now, where we have to take this delays everything for months and years.
Mhm. I don't see really that the modeling will slow down the process. It's my experience that it goes faster using the models because it's very much the communication among people to understand the problem and how complex the planning process actually are. You get these conflicts because you don't have every people on board on the idea of constructing certain things. So it's no matter if it's new infrastructure or big industry objects or whatever. So it's a tricky thing which both have to make a more effective, but also good, high quality communication among people, I think. And the modeling can help there, especially one thing I believe a little bit, or quite a lot yet, that when modeling both human movements and human needs and ecology at the same time for a certain planning project, then we can easier also communicate among different stakeholders how to solve this, because it becomes more clear what will be the effect of doing this or doing this. Can we just change a little bit? Can we add something to make a thing that is good both for that interest and that interest?
Maybe adding to that, it's about including local communities in the making of decisions either way, whether it's a Tesla factory or it's a nature reserve, just getting the buy-in from the community, even if it's split almost half-half, it's their decision rather than something that was imposed externally, because that will almost always backfire. And people don't like being told what to do. Kind of human nature. Okay. Thank you very, very much for attending this talk today. Just a reminder, we are co-hosting this as the Ecological Survey Techniques team and the Sustainable Urban Development team. So do click on the QR codes and check out our programs. We would love to hear from you. And if you have further interest in this, we're here for you. And hopefully see you in some of our future events. Thank you very much.